I hope you're all having a great day. There's a lot of questions as to how this Trump administration is going to handle the question of South America, Central America, and also the Caribbean, including, of course, one of the most important stories in U.S. imperialism in the global South, which is that of Cuba. Joining me today is one of the most premier experts we have in the Western world on Cuba, Dr. Steve Wilkinson. He's considered one of the UK's leading experts on Cuba and U.S.-Cuba relations. We were just talking a brief moment ago. He first visited Cuba in 1987, and he's been traveling there and reporting and documenting what's been going on. So, Doctor, thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me on, Jackson. Good to see you.
Of course. What do you, what do you think this Trump administration is going to have in the cards for Cuba? And we'll talk about the history of Cuba and how things have evolved. But for starters, you have someone like Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. How do you think this Trump administration will handle Cuba after they presumably handle the bigger crises in the world right now that they're dealing with?
So, well, we've already seen a number of actions that the Trump administration has taken in its first 100 days. I mean, shortly before he left office, the Biden administration removed some of the measures that had been imposed by the Trump administration 2016 to 2020, which the Biden administration hadn't removed until right at the end of the presidency. Well, the first thing the Trump administration did was restore all of those measures. They include the enaction of Title III of the notorious Helms-Burton law, which allows for individuals who were former owners of property in Cuba to sue the present users of that property in the island. We saw them restore Cuba to the list of state sponsors of terrorism, which severely affects Cuba's ability to function in the international markets, particularly the financial markets. And we saw the return of Cuba to, or the restoration of what is known as the restricted entities list, which prohibits the activities of companies dealing in Cuba with certain companies and institutions in Cuba, all of which have the effect of increasing the pressure, economic pressure on the island, which is already extremely severe. And this is intended, as always, to increase the tension, political tension in the island. The objective really is to try and engender some kind of social disruption, some kind of social uprising, which can then be fastened upon as a reason to intervene in a humanitarian way. They're trying to create a humanitarian disaster on the island, but essentially, which will give an excuse for some kind of intervention, possibly even military intervention. And these things aren't fantastical. I mean, some of the people you mentioned, like Marco Rubio himself, have talked openly about this sort of thing. So, yeah, you can expect greater hardship. The other thing that the administration has started to do, which it didn't do before, which is, of course, part of this migration policy, is to return migrants to Cuba. So not only does the United States create a situation on the island whereby people are forced to seek some kind of improvement of their living conditions by basically some member of the family leaving the island to go and work in the United States so they can send money back to their family. They create the demand for migration, and then when these people arrive, they're now sending them back to Cuba. So there is an enormous paradox and a contradiction in the policy, but the whole thing is aimed at creating as much tension and pressure in the island as possible.
When you look at Cuba over the years, what do you think are the biggest problems that they've had to overcome? You mentioned a few just now. The naval blockade, I think most people would cite. But also, how would you factor in the decline in leadership? Possibly, people talk about that as well. And you had Fidel getting very old, and then, of course, passing away. And how has that also played a role?
Well, Jackson, I mean, as somebody who's kind of followed Cuba for a long time, and of course lived through the days when everybody said, "Oh, when Castro dies, the system will collapse. It depends entirely upon him." Well, they were proven wrong completely. I mean, Castro left office in 2006. He died in 2016, and we're now in 2025. And there doesn't seem to have been any kind of change in the political system. So what does that tell you? Well, that tells you that the institutions in Cuba are really strong. So you have a number of very well-organized and highly supported by the population institutions. You have, obviously, the Communist Party, but you also have the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry, the Defense Ministry, which is the army. And these two institutions together really control the country, and they're very, very strong. So when it comes to leadership, the leadership's always been actually a collective leadership. It had this very charismatic and personalized leader under Fidel Castro, and then to somewhat less extent under Raul Castro. But essentially, they constructed a very, very durable and formidable apparatus, which is showing no signs of weakening. So, I mean, I feel as though the system is going to continue even under enormous pressure. When you ask me what are the biggest obstacles they've faced and so on, by far the biggest obstacle has been both the economic embargo, if you want to call it embargo or a blockade, as the Cubans call it, of the United States, which has shown various facets. It's intensified at times and then declined at times. And in conjunction with that, the other factors of American or US interference, the ongoing infiltration of agents, the introduction of money, the organization of the opposition within the island, the support of opposition outside the island. In the past, of course, that involved, in fact, supporting terrorist organizations that carried out attacks inside Cuba. I mean, the most recent ones, of course, were only in the 1990s. There were bombing attacks in Havana in the 1990s. There have been numerous plots since then of terror attempts that have been thwarted by the Cuban security agencies. So the United States applies an enormous amount of pressure, both political, financial, on Cuba, and that has been the biggest problem they face. And of course, they've always had to deal with the problem of scarcity. They never had enough resources to, even in the best of times, enough capital to develop the economy, but in the worst of times, just not enough resources to actually maintain the economy. So that's why you see so much, buildings that are not finished or falling down, bad roads, bad infrastructure, etc., etc., etc. This has been a system that has continually and consistently had to deal with numerous crises and pressures, which have been primarily a result of the way the United States has treated it. Of course, the best period of its development was during the Cold War, when it was frozen out of the Western capitalist sphere and was obliged to enter the Soviet economic sphere, and received an enormous amount of support from the Soviet Union, which enabled it to develop its very world-renowned medical system and its education system. Those two things have stood it in very good stead since the collapse of the Soviet Union, because both of them have helped it to sustain itself, because it has a very highly educated workforce, scientific workforce, which has been able to both provide a source of income through the export of biotechnology and medical services, and also provided it with a measure of internal resourcefulness and the ability to adapt quickly to the situations that have arisen.
You know, moving forward for Cuba, you said that the leadership hasn't deteriorated in any huge way, but you can only live in a crumbling state of affairs with I guess leadership that is not changing much. I mean, I wouldn't say it's gotten stronger from what I've seen. Do you think that could be a problem here that Cuba faces? The fact that things are not advancing, but staying the same and worse. I mean, when I went, it was just, I went 2 years ago, as I said, it was a very, very sad state of affairs, uncomparable to what I've seen in, basically any other country, even going to Yemen, going to Venezuela. Obviously, these are countries with far more resources and the ability to trade. But do you think this will be a big problem that could actually bring about what the U.S. wants, which is the collapse of the revolution in Cuba?
Well, Warren, I'm a bit surprised you said it. You got the impression Cuba was worse than Yemen. I've been going to Cuba annually for since 1987, more or less, and I've spent extended periods of time there. I was there, the last time I was there was last February, but I shall be going again this September. If you think it was bad in two years ago, you should have been there in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, that was far worse than it has been recently, even though they've had these problems with blackouts and so on. Back in the 90s, it was far worse. You see, there is a tremendous paradox, which is why this situation is not going to end soon, or if it does end soon, it will end very badly. And I'll tell you why. This is the problem. The basic fundamental factor that determines the continuation of the Cuban communist system is, in fact, the enmity of the United States. In other words, the more the United States puts pressure on the Cubans, the more the Cubans will be determined to resist. And that's because there's a historic reason for this. The Cubans see themselves as being in a continual state of trying to assert their sovereignty. They were the last colony of Spain to become independent at the end of the 19th century. They fought 3 wars of independence in a space of 45 years against Spain. And then at the moment that they were about to liberate themselves, the United States intervened and essentially bought Cuba from Spain, along with the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico, for $20 million. And then they occupied Cuba for 4 years. And then they established a republic there, which had a constitution that was more or less written for Cuba by the United States. So then for another 50 years, 59, 57 years, Cuba was essentially a neo-colony of the United States. And the revolution in 1959 was actually not even the first revolution in the 20th century. There was a full-blown socialist revolution in Cuba in 1933. There was an uprising in 1906, which necessitated the American government to send in the Marines to try and stop it. And there was another uprising in 1912. So Cuba was really never happy with the settlement that the United States gave it in 1902. And they saw the problems that they had as being a result of United States interference. So what Fidel Castro's revolution represented was an assertion of Cuban independence and sovereignty against the United States. And that's the problem. The United States wishes to impose itself on Cuba and will meet resistance from the Cubans. So the Cubans will resist, even if they are suffering enormously. They will accept the situation that they have. The vast majority of them will. And this is a big problem for the United States because the Cuban population is really quite large. It's not a small island, it's quite a big island, and it has a substantial population. The consequences of American policy at the moment are, first of all, to create the conditions for a huge confrontation, which could result in numerous disastrous consequences. In 1993-4, the last time there was very severe hardship in Cuba, which led to a large pressure for migration, there was the so-called rafters crisis, where thousands of Cubans took to homemade rafts and boats and tried to sail to the United States. And it resulted in the Clinton administration having to declare a state of emergency in Florida. Quite honestly, that scenario repeated would be, not beyond the bounds of possibility. But in this case, with the Trump administration, their response might be, and some of the members of the administration, principally people like Maria Salazar, for example, Maria Elvira Salazar and people like that, and Rubio himself, would be to call for some kind of military intervention by the United States in Cuba, which would then result in a conflict. And quite honestly, the Cubans will fight, and it will be very, very unsettling and quite possibly disastrous for the United States, in my view, because they would be fighting on the island their own soldiers. It won't be a proxy war, and their own soldiers will be dying in Cuba because the Cubans are prepared for this, and they've been prepared since 1962. You see, the other thing you have to remember is the United States had a plan to invade Cuba in 1962, which was only thwarted by the missile crisis. If the missiles hadn't been discovered, then in November, they were planning to invade Cuba. The crisis intervened and prevented that, and after that, the United States couldn't really contemplate invading Cuba anymore. But the Cubans, without the missiles, then had to defend themselves. So they developed a civilian army. There's 2.5 million Cubans that are trained and ready to fight as soon as an invasion happens, and they are, periodically on maneuvers, and they are really prepared. So it won't be an easy thing if the United States were stupid enough to intervene militarily. On the other hand, as well, you've got to remember that Cuba has an awful lot of friends in the world. It's not alone. Mm-hmm. And I can't foresee a situation where, under the current administration and its policy towards China, of China abandoning Cuba. If you go to Cuba right now, you will see that Cuba has actually addressed the oil shortage. The main problem with the shortage of oil was the electricity supply, because most of the electricity was generated using oil-fired power stations. Well, they've installed in incredibly quick time enormous solar farms. So there's massive amounts of solar energy being developed in Cuba very, very rapidly. I mean, they have done this so quickly, and they couldn't have done it without the assistance of China. These solar panels are coming from China. So China is helping Cuba a great deal at the moment, and I can't see the Chinese abandoning Cuba to the fate of the United States, especially with the United States having the policy it has towards China right now. So I don't think there's going to be a collapse of the political system in Cuba. I think that's one of the least likely scenarios. I may be wrong, but if you wouldn't, I'm not a betting person, but I would say the odds against that happening are really, really high.
To what degree do you think U.S. NGOs and influence operations have negatively impacted the Cuban public, specifically the youth and the Afro-Cuban population? I know Max Blumenthal did some interesting reporting. I think it was around 2021, maybe, when they had the that slogan with the rappers, the Afro-Cuban rappers. I'm forgetting it right now off the top of my head. I'm sure you remember. But that, and then also, when I was there, one thing that really was surprising to me, I've got no problems with people, doing whatever they want in their homes and whatever sort of sexual orientation they have. But I was surprised to see Cuba, an Orthodox Marxist country, when you look at their history, waving a lot of these LGBT flags around. And this was surprising to me. And I think it's probably as a result of, U.S. NGOs operating and certain figures in the Cuban political elite that have become very sympathetic towards that.
This is a really interesting question, Jackson. I'm glad you asked this, because the way you just put it is very interesting. The interference by U.S. and so-called NGOs, basically financed through U.S. aid. A lot of money goes from U.S. aid into NGOs based in Florida that then spend the money trying to do subversive activities in Cuba. The National Endowment for Democracy, which has recently been in the news because the Trump administration defunded it, they were very, very influential in developing both the Cuban American lobby, the kind of APAC of Cuba that was developed in Florida during the Reagan administration in the 1980s. That was all done through U.S. government funding. And so this whole lobby, this whole kind of industry of anti-Castro, anti-communist, anti-Cuba stuff that happens in Florida, a lot of the money that supports these Congress people that are so anti-Castro, anti-communist in Florida, a lot of them are supported indirectly through agencies that are ostensibly NGOs or whatever, but they actually receive their money from U.S. taxpayers. I mean, there's a kind of gravy train going round and round and round there. That's another story. And they do operate in Cuba. They do try to, influence the youth, etc., etc. And they have been involved in kind of social media type activities. They try and organize opposition, etc., etc. Absolutely true. How effective it is debatable. Like we've just been discussing, the system is very strong. And most of the youth in Cuba are actually very, very revolutionary. They're very socialist, and they see through a lot of this stuff. That's the case. That's the truth. But the question about LGBTQ rights and so on is an interesting one, because Cuba was, in the 1980s, considered to be, by when the United States was much more liberal than it is now, was considered to be a huge violator of human rights because it was considered to be homophobic. And it received an enormous amount of criticism from the United States and Western liberal governments because it had this policy during the AIDS epidemic of incarcerating homosexuals who were found to be HIV positive. Cuba had a policy of quarantining anyone who was HIV positive in a sanatoria to prevent them from spreading the disease in the population. And this was considered to be homophobic because most of the people that were found to be HIV positive were homosexuals. So Cuba was labeled as a homophobic country, and it had a history during the 1960s also of repressing homosexuality. So it was a pariah state because it was anti-gay. And then during the 1990s, when the AIDS epidemic subsided and ways of dealing with it were found, Cuba changed its policy, relaxed this quarantine policy, and began to reform its attitude towards homosexuality. And in fact, the leader of this movement within Cuban society was Raul Castro's daughter, who was a sexologist. And they have got now, Cuba now is one of the most sexually progressive in this gender sexual progressive countries in Latin America. There are quite a lot of countries in Latin America which still have, outlaw homosexuality in all its forms and so on. But Cuba has transformed itself into a country which is extremely tolerant, and they just passed a new family law which recognizes same-sex families and also other kinds of families. It's a tremendously progressive law which they've just passed. So the idea of Cuba being a country which is extremely repressive, particularly morally repressive, is a mistake. It isn't. And one of the curious things about Cuba, of course, as well, is that it isn't particularly a Catholic country. The number of practitioners of Catholicism in Cuba is relatively low for a Latin American country. Something like only 25% of the population are Catholic and practice the religion. The rest of the people don't. So Cuba's an interesting place, Jackson, for a lot of reasons.
Yeah. I just look at that and it always seemed weird to me. I always forget what relation she had to Fidel, the niece. But it's like, you have so much U.S. pressure on this issue. And, you look at any of these Orthodox Marxist countries, and they all had a very firm position on traditional values. And then after all this pressure is exerted on Cuba, instead of this woman focusing on developing Cuba and trying to build its relations and, advance its economy and the standard of living, it seems a bit odd that she was so focused on this and building bridges with these NGOs in the U.S. Isn't that a little weird?
No, I mean, they didn't develop very many relations with NGOs in the United States when they did this. It was pretty autochthonous movement. In fact, the development of the attitude towards homosexuality was homegrown in Cuba. It was a number of Cuban doctors, actually Cuban doctors that had studied in East Germany, which East Germany, believe it or not, the former DDR, was also quite progressive in terms of its policy towards homosexuality. It's not true that all of these Marxist countries were the same in that respect. And they formed, this was in the 1980s, they formed the opinion that homosexuality was not an illness, it wasn't an aberration, it was a natural phenomenon, and that it shouldn't be persecuted in any way. So it was a general progression of that kind of current of scientific psychological thought amongst the medical profession in Cuba, which led to the relaxation in the end. But coming back to your original point about Marxist countries being traditional, this isn't the case either, Jackson. If you look at particularly, you say orthodox Marxist countries. If you look at orthodox Marxism, Engels and Marx were very antithetical to the idea of the family. Engels wrote a book called The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, in which they said the family, the heterosexual family, was actually a form of imprisonment of women, and the way that patriarchy and the patriarchal line, the inheritance of money and wealth, was guaranteed through the idea of a monogamous relationship. And they were very critical of this. And if you look at the history of the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the revolution in 1917, probably the first 10 years before this, the 1930s, the first 10 years, there was an enormous amount of sexual experimentation in Moscow. The establishment of alternative forms of reproduction, communes of various kinds, free love associations, etc., etc., etc. There was an enormous amount of rejection of the traditional values. It was a kind of a moral counter-revolution that took place under people attribute it to Stalin, but whether or not it was actually anything to do with Stalin's personal intervention. But during that period, there was a retrenchment, or a return to a more traditional approach. And that situation, though, in Cuba is also quite tenuous. You see, much of this kind of moral social structure predates any kind of imposition of any kind of socialist or Marxist thought. The basic fabric of society is something that has evolved over many years. Now, you have to remember that Cuba was a plantation economy, and it had an enormous number of slaves, something like approaching half the population of Cuba in the 19th century were African slaves, who, of course, were denied natural family relationships in bondage. They were mainly men. They were corralled and kept on plantations. So you had a very in much of the population, very tenuous familial traditions, because they were broken by the institution of slavery. So the nature and the composition of Cuban society is one in which there is quite a malleable social fabric. It's not that there have been very long civilizational established mores that have been consistent. If you compare, for example, Cuba with China, China was an imperial dynastic system that lasted for thousands and thousands of years, that were more or less governed by the same principles for centuries and centuries and centuries. So there you have a deep tradition fabric of society based around certain mores and familial structures that predate communism. And therefore, the kind of communism that exists in China is completely different from the kind of communism that could exist or would exist in a place like Cuba, which has a completely different history. So you can't really make generalizations of that kind, even about communist countries, which on the surface, to many people in the West, appear to be the same. They're not. And Cuba is an exceptional case. There is no other country in the world like Cuba. And that's why it's fascinating. And that's why people go there and they see something that is not only unusual, it's very puzzling, because there are so many questions that are raised by, the experience of going to Cuba and seeing this place. I mean, you must have experienced that yourself.
It was definitely lots of history, and it was a very beautiful place, and I really didn't get to see much. Anyone who has ever been to Cuba and seen a good swath of the country has told me that, look, if you just go to Havana, you really didn't see much. And that's all I did. So hopefully one day I get to see more. And hopefully, with the entry to BRICS as a BRICS partner country, Cuba continues to advance and utilizes its own resources and its international allies and overcomes the challenges that it's facing.
So Jackson, I'm hopefully taking a group of students from the University of Buckingham, where I work, to Cuba in September. You should come along for the trip. And
I would love to.
Yeah, you should do it. We're going for just a week in September, and
it'd be my honor.
Yeah, you should come. It'd be great fun.
Well, I know there's I'm in Moscow right now. There's direct flights, so I'll hop on one of those and I'll come out and hopefully see a lot more than I saw last time. I was just so shocked. One of the things I was shocked by was maybe I was going to the wrong places, but even the prices for like just a meal, maybe I was falling into the tourist traps. I tried to go to not touristy areas and stuff too. And maybe they just upcharge me because I'm a gringo, but I was shocked by some of the prices too. I'm like, how do people afford it here? It's crazy.
So yeah, that's another thing. You cannot understand Cuba without understanding the way that works, right? Okay. But I mean, that's another program. I could talk to you for hours about that.
Okay. Let's talk again then. And there's stuff I didn't even get to here. We didn't talk about BRICS, but I'd love to talk again and before September, and then hopefully I can join you then. All right.
That'll be great. I didn't know you were in Moscow, by the way. So we didn't talk about either Russia-Cuba relations, because that's very strong as well. I mean, Moscow, I think Moscow is the only country in the world where there is a statue of Fidel Castro.
It's a beautiful fact.
Fidel Castro didn't want any statues of himself. There aren't any in Cuba, right?
There might be one in the, isn't there like I could be wrong about this, but I think there's like a small little patch of lands that Cuba actually owns in America. Isn't there there might be a statue there. I'm not sure. There's like some little embassy type thing that they own. And I don't know. I'll try to find it and send you a picture. But anyways, thank you so much for joining me today. And it was a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot. So let's talk again, and then we'll talk about September as well.
My pleasure.